A very warm welcome. You're joining us at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. We thought about talking a little about regional issues and how geopolitics, international relations, extremism, how that affects the region, and what countries can do in order to cooperate, cooperate at a larger scale in ensuring that we together face these global threats. I've invited to our studios at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24 the Afghan ambassador to Sri Lanka, His Excellency Ashraf Haidari. A warm welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thank you for coming. I think, Ambassador, I thought maybe before I start talking a little about Afghanistan's situation, to touch a little about your postings previously. You were with the strategy, policy and strategy. You were the Director General of the Foreign Ministry of Afghanistan, and previously you were also in New Delhi, and you've been overseeing what happens in the region, not just from an Afghan point of view, but you've worked closely in our part of the region. What is your current observation?
Current observations, of course, there are many opportunities in our very youthful and resourceful region. If you think about South Asia, you think about massive population who are mostly young and have common needs and interests. If you talk to youth in Sri Lanka, next door in India, next door in Pakistan, next door in Afghanistan, they all have common needs and interests and aspirations. And of course, also it's a region filled with natural resources. Just to speak of natural resources in Afghanistan, we're worth over $1 trillion worth of minerals such as lithium, copper, iron ore, precious and semi-precious stones. And so is Pakistan. So is, of course, India, massive country, and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's beauty that's so captivating and so attractive. And so there is much that our region could focus on collaborating and cooperating and partnering against confrontation, against the status quo existing tensions. And that's possible. I think if countries that have those tensions make a move towards a normalization of relationship, rapprochement, focusing on a win-win agenda of cooperation on issues of shared need and interest and aspirations of their populations. And on the security, again, we have shared interests and concerns from the ongoing war and terrorism and extremism and organized crime, unfortunately, in Afghanistan, that's very much imposed to the problem of climate change that is equally affecting our region, and of course the pandemic of COVID that has been around over the past year. So there are many avenues for cooperation, and me as an Afghan diplomat, our foreign policy, all being about promoting cooperation along those lines, be it challenges or be it the opportunities for cooperation, is to promote that.
62 years of diplomatic relations between Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, but we face similar challenges, but of course a long war in Afghanistan. Sri Lanka successfully defeated terrorism, a 3-decade terror threat, and yet 10 years after peace, we faced the threat of extremism in the form of bombings to churches and hotels on Easter Sunday. But we see this happening in Afghanistan too. Regionally, there is a massive threat, be it maritime, be it other cross-border crime. But how are you looking at this, not as a diplomat, but as an expert in foreign policy? What opportunities do we have here to work together? Especially because I think when we talk about extremism, Afghanistan has a lot of experience dealing with these elements.
Exactly, especially between Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, we've been discussing security and defense and law enforcement cooperation to join hands in the fight against extremists, and radical elements and terrorists, as you pointed out, had Sri Lanka, unfortunately, and killed many innocent civilians in April of last year, as they do, unfortunately, every single day in Afghanistan. When last year I was talking to some of your politicians and leaders, I was telling them that if terrorists have bombed, churches in Afghanistan, they're bombing mosques, they're killing Muslims. So it's not about, Muslim versus Christian or Christian versus Buddhist. We all, share a common enemy, and terrorists and extremists who unfortunately undermine regional peace and security. And that's why we, Afghanistan, encourage intelligence sharing, cooperation with Sri Lanka on the threats from terrorism, extremism, and drug trafficking, which again has affected Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is not only a consuming country, but also a transit country. And unfortunately, the problem of cultivation and production of drugs in Afghanistan is very much imposed. It's because of the permissiveness of the environment, because if there were no war, then of course we would be focused on sustainable development of the provinces where unfortunately the Taliban have influenced more or less their territories where they control, and it's under their control where this cultivation and production happens, and it's also under their influence and control that drugs produced in Afghanistan are trafficked outside in our region, Southeast Asia through Iran, and of course to South Asia through Pakistan and or India, and then from Sri Lanka to other countries. And so on all those areas there are opportunities to cooperate and collaborate, and we have a defense cooperation MOU in the pipeline to be signed, under which we can achieve all those goals once that's done.
Something I'd like to talk extensively is about de-radicalization, talking more about extremist elements and about the war against drugs, because Sri Lanka has taken this very seriously. This is a massive threat here in Sri Lanka too. But specifically about the Afghan peace process, I understand that you have penned your overall experience, including Sri Lanka's wartime experience and Sri Lanka's experience in eliminating terrorism. How long have you been here in Sri Lanka now?
Well, I've been here for the past 2 years, and of course the experience of Sri Lanka from war to peace is quite instructive, as you exactly pointed out. You fought separatism and terrorism for 3 decades, so Sri Lanka does have a lot of relevant combat experience, against insurgency and terrorism. Our situation is a little bit more complex because we're not, fighting a separatist terrorist network per se, but we are fighting a, number of regional and global terrorist and extremist groups, all of which operate under the umbrella of the Taliban. If you look at, Al-Qaeda was sheltered by the Taliban before 9/11 in Afghanistan. There was years that the Taliban misruled Afghanistan, which we had been, telling the world, warning the United States, and our former president actually once went to the U.S. Congress and warned them, and then of course Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, the national hero of Afghanistan, also warned Europe, because he paid a visit to European Union, and is on record to say that if you don't pay attention to Afghanistan, don't join hands with us to fight, terrorism and extremism, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and related networks and groups in Afghanistan, that, they will gradually attack you and hit you. And that's exactly what happened on 9/11. And unfortunately, these networks are still in play. They're still sheltered in the neighborhood and supported by certain state actors, about which we continue warning our region and the rest of the world, as we did in the recent Geneva conference on Afghanistan, where About 100 states and international organizations came together to continue pledging financial aid to Afghanistan and our ongoing, journey of securing peace and democracy, pluralism, and everything that we have achieved over the past 20 years. So, and all of the things that I said, I think we can learn lessons from Sri Lanka. Mediated peace processes, if you recall, because as you were fighting the terrorists, you were also, pursuing a peace process, much like we are. And I think the lesson that we should learn from Sri Lanka is to be decisive. And I think that's the lesson that I once discussed with His Excellency President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the Honorable Prime Minister, both of whom really led your war against terrorism to success. And the lesson, I think, the advice from them is to be decisive. And we completely agree with them. Our leadership completely agrees with them that unless you, fight from, a position of strength to secure peace, it's really hard to imagine that the terrorists would actually deliver peace at the negotiating table. Something that we have been trying to do. Remember, before the Afghan negotiating team went to Doha, we at this consultative peace jirga, Grand Council, inviting over 3,000 Afghan representatives, including women and youth from across Afghanistan, to come to Kabul to discuss, the way forward in terms of reaching a political settlement with the Taliban. So they endorsed the agenda of the Afghan government, and they came with a resolution. And the resolution being that, we make a concession to release over 5,000 Taliban prisoners, and return the Taliban, cease violence, cease terrorism against the Afghan people, and start a meaningful, results-driven peace dialogue with the team of the Islamic Republic. So as a group, then they, negotiate an outcome with us, which would basically address, this imposed war in Afghanistan and put an end to it, and invite the Taliban to become a part of what we call the, a constitutional framework of Afghanistan, to, part of their society, and which we would facilitate.
Right. I think on that note, we'll take a short commercial break here at Hyde Park. To stay with us. Welcome back, and we're in conversation with the Afghan ambassador to Sri Lanka, Ashraf Haidari. Ambassador, talking about the war in Afghanistan, the US has indicated that the very long war in Afghanistan has to be brought to a responsible conclusion. This also means that 2,500 troops will be leaving Afghanistan, and while there will be about 2,000 still stationed. What does this feel for you, for your people, for Afghanistan? What is your sentiment?
Well, the Afghan people do not want any international forces in Afghanistan for a single day. The reason why international forces are in Afghanistan are foremost for the homeland security interests of their own nations. Remember that the United States had no forces in Afghanistan throughout 1990s, and they came to Afghanistan following the tragedy of 9/11, and they came because of this converging national security interests of our two countries. We think the threats are still there. We think that, of course, the peace process has not taken off. We're working on it. We've done our part. We have made significant, notable, tangible concessions, releasing 5,500 prisoners of the Taliban, including war criminals. There were 40 war criminals with terrorist and drug trafficking charges that we released in order to make a tangible start in the Doha peace talks. But unfortunately, that has not happened. So I think responsible withdrawal is the key word, as you said. We encourage a conditions-based withdrawal of U.S. forces and the rest of other allies in Afghanistan once that we have seen our shared journey through. Because if we fail and falter, then all the gains of the past 19 years, which of course include a democratic state building, including our constitution that ensures and guarantees equal rights between men and women, empowerment of women. Imagine under the Taliban, half of our population was completely isolated. This was a medieval government that women like you couldn't imagine to be a news anchor, to be a journalist. They couldn't even be a doctor to treat female patients. So that's not the era that any country in the world, any country in the neighborhood, including Sri Lanka, as an oldest democracy in South Asia, wants to see us to go back to. And so because global peace and security is so much intertwined, the United States and NATO cannot afford to abandon Afghanistan for their own sake. But then, of course, morally speaking, for the sake of the Afghan people who've made, sacrifices every single day. We've lost thousands of forces. We're losing on any given day hundreds of people, including civilians, to terrorist attacks by the Taliban, by Al-Qaeda, and by Daesh, and other networks that operate under their umbrella. So that's why we encourage a responsible, conditions-based withdrawal, based very much on the South Asia strategy, which President Trump had proposed earlier, and which now President-elect Joe Biden also supports, that that they have to withdraw at some point, but do so responsibly to make sure that Afghanistan would not slide back into where we were back in 1990s.
You've experienced working with the United Nations, including the UNHRC and WHCR and WFP. Tell us a little about your engagements with these global organizations as a government, as the Afghan government, because as you know, Sri Lanka has had a bit of a tough time in the past dealing with the organizations, but again, accountability issues in terms of human rights violations, these have been brought up constantly. But if you talk about Afghanistan, we do talk about a lot of violations, a lot of human rights violations to the people. If you talk about the most, the smallest possible way, women lose their men at war, and then education to the rights of the people to determine their future. Sure. Tell us a little about what's going on, what the government wants, what the people wants, when you especially deal with conditions that are imposed on your country.
Well, the government in Afghanistan and the people are on the same page, and that's what the negotiating team of the Islamic Republic represent in Doha. We have an inclusive, team in Doha that represent all groups and including youth and women, and Doha, reflecting the resolutions of the consultative peace jirga in Afghanistan. So what people in Afghan government seek to achieve and continue achieving is the further consolidation of our democracy still as a work in progress. So we have gained so much over the past 19 years. We'd like to further consolidate that. That's foremost good for the Afghan people in terms of peace, security, prosperity, and a sustainable development agenda promoted by the United Nations and Afghanistan, as well as, of course, the Secretary General himself. You look at his tweets, everyday tweets, 2-3 things, encourages a global ceasefire so that we together in the world fight this pandemic and find a solution to it through vaccines and vaccinations, and also to discontinue war, violence, terrorism in countries like Afghanistan. Then also he writes about climate change. Afghanistan is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, and I think that is an agenda that resonates with us when we support. So you mentioned UN. UN has been an effective partner in Afghanistan, and they report daily and quarterly on the violations of human rights by the Taliban and related terrorist networks in Afghanistan, daily killing, dozens and scores of innocent civilians against international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and of course violating the United Nations Charter. And so, but we can do more with the UN in terms of ensuring aid effectiveness in Afghanistan, which was very much on the agenda of the recent Geneva conference. We discussed, our measures in the fight against corruption. That's an expectation from the international community in return for, the aid monies that they provide. But we also have demanded a, greater degree of ensuring aid effectiveness on the part of the, the donor community. Some of whom channel their aid resources to Afghanistan through United Nations agencies, including WFP, which is now a Nobel Peace Prize winner, with which I have the honor of having worked for 3-4 years in Afghanistan and Central Asia, and as well as UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which has been active in Afghanistan. I had the honor of having worked with them in Afghanistan and Tajikistan and as well as in Geneva, Switzerland.
Right.
And so those two front agencies have been doing quite well in Afghanistan, helping IDPs, refugees, returnees, and providing food where malnourishment and hunger is unfortunately a problem. And so, but of course they can do more in terms of aid effectiveness and working with us to ensure mutual accountability for us to properly design programs and implement them to satisfy the reporting needs and transparency needs of the donor community, and for the UN agencies to do as well. So and all of this we seek partnership, in close collaboration and cooperation, strategic coordination, to make sure that whatever aid monies that come, taxpayers, ultimately it's the money of citizens of those countries, that they're properly spent in Afghanistan to assist Afghanistan.
You did mention about conditions-based withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. If you may shed some light into what particularly the top issues and conditions that will be put forward.
Well, conditions is all about violence. Violence drops down. There's a ceasefire, and confidence goes up, and people see that peace and security every day for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. In accordance with that, then forces could draw down. As we see peace as a peace dividend, forces could withdraw down, and these large amounts of funding is spent on maintaining international military presence in Afghanistan that could focus on sustainable development, on post-conflict reconstruction, much like Sri Lanka. You ended your war in 2009, right. And since you've been focused on peace building. Sustainable development in areas where fighting and destruction took place. I had a very productive visit to Jaffna, and I saw lots of ongoing projects. I had a good meeting with the Army commander, the Navy commander. They showed me around, and things continue moving on there. And I think we should do the same thing.
Right. I think we'll take a short commercial break here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. Welcome back. Ambassador Haidari, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right.
Yes, you do. Thank you.
So I thought we'll talk a little about Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, how we can explore opportunities to expand trade. I know Afghans love Ceylon tea. So yes. How we can expand these opportunities to, especially because Sri Lankan exports are hampered, imports restricted in the current context. COVID-19 and the challenges, but I'm sure Afghanistan too has its own challenges as a result of the ongoing pandemic, global pandemic that threatens us with many fears. But I did see a press release recently that the Ceylon Chamber has identified yes. Afghanistan as a potential market to further expand business with Sri Lanka. What areas are we looking at? You've also signed MOUs and certain partnership agreements on expanding trade and investment.
Yes, I think, yes, the pandemic is there and it's slowly being resolved, but we shouldn't wait for that. And I think we can work on so much groundwork that's there to be done, and that's exactly I've been focusing on, not waiting for the pandemic, not waiting for other challenges to be resolved in order to focus on trade, because trade is something that all nations need, because we all need jobs. And so both Afghanistan and Sri Lanka cannot afford to just sit and do nothing. So we've moved on and signed this agreement between the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and the Afghanistan Chamber of Commerce and Investment. And because, I was, before coming to this interview, working actually on a meeting to be arranged between the desk managers of the two chambers, and then for them to help the value group, whose executive just recently dropped by the embassy, expressing an interest, much like you read, as he had read, about this collaboration between the chambers of commerce to explore export of tea, Ceylon tea, to Afghanistan, which I very much welcome, because the volume of trade, unfortunately, is so low between Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. We do more trade with Maldives than Sri Lanka. Well, of course, Sri Lanka, in a much larger island, and you have so many products such as tea, of course, textiles, apparel, and coconut-based products, and spices, and food and beverage, I think, which we import from the rest of the region. But quality-wise, I think Sri Lankan products are of higher quality, especially some of your biscuits that I've had, really good, and especially this ginger biscuit that I often have with the Ceylon tea, and I say this makes a perfect couple match for Afghans to have Ceylon tea with Sri Lanka's ginger biscuits, and I've been promoting all of these to be exported to Afghanistan, and from Afghanistan, of course, we have our dried nuts, which Sri Lankans demand, like almonds, pistachios, and walnuts, and pines, and so forth. And then fresh fruits. Afghanistan has the world's best pomegranates, and apples, and pears, peaches, a variety of grapes, which we export to India, to the Gulf countries, and even as far as Europe. And that's why we've encouraged connectivity. And I had a very good meeting with His Excellency President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who listened really, and then he said that we have to have a flight between Kabul and Colombo. And he immediately helped arrange a meeting for me to see the executives of the Sri Lankan Airlines, and they were immediately interested, because as they saw about the demand, not only in cargo, but also tourists from Afghanistan, because Afghans have been to countries in the region a lot, and to the Gulf countries a lot, but they like to explore further afield, which is Sri Lanka, of course, the paradise on earth, and a friendly nation. In Sri Lanka, Afghans think very highly of Sri Lankans.
I'm sure you have traveled the island during your stay.
Yes, I've been traveling almost every 2 weeks or so. I've been to the north, south, and east. I'm going to the east Trincomalee again, working with the Sri Lankan Navy to organize another visit. I look forward to meeting with the local officials and connecting with the community leaders, from all different communities of Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka is so much like Afghanistan, so pluralistic, so diverse, and so beautiful. And so we Afghans and Sri Lankans connect, and that's why we're so mentally, politically, economically, and commercially aligned. We have a foreign policy that matches that of yours. I think you recently talked to your foreign policy leaders, and they said you're multi-aligned, while you stay
neutral and non-aligned.
Yes, stay outside of others' tensions. And we in Afghanistan are seeking the same thing, seeking friendly relations with near and far neighborhood countries like Sri Lanka, while staying away from other countries, geopolitical rivalries and tensions. And so that's why I see no reason for the jewel of the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, and the heart of Asia, that is Afghanistan, not to come together. It's very possible. There's unreserved, strong interest on the side of our leadership, and on your side, both, like I said, the President, the Prime Minister, who strongly support our growing relationship. They've been exchanging tweets after tweets after tweets, and press releases after press releases, and we just recently exchanged letters between our two foreign ministers, and celebrating the 62nd anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, focusing on all those issues, from defense, security, political, economic, commercial, trade, to cultural, and people to people.
So I'm sorry if I may also interrupt, Ambassador. You were talking about tourism and how we can promote tourism between the two countries, but how exactly can we do that? Yes, you spoke about a Colombo-Kabul direct flight, but again, there are many areas that we can look at. Tourism is hit in Sri Lanka, not just because of the pandemic, but the Easter Sunday attacks too.
But it was, I think, reviving. It was coming back after the Easter attacks.
We came back. That was the resilience of the industry, but somehow the pandemic took its toll on the country's industry. But how do we look at expanding this area?
Well,
what do you have in mind?
Right now we should work on the frameworks, continue signing MOUs and agreements. We have about 7 in the pipeline focusing on all those areas that we should continue signing. As we slowly also work on connectivity, as the COVID-19 travel restrictions have eased, and I expect that to happen as vaccines come online and we start vaccinating. And on the tourism, like I said, potentially the demand in Afghanistan is vast, but also higher education tourism and medical tourism. Here you have lots of demand in Afghanistan. Which once there is a flight, then a lot of Afghans will principally come here for 3 purposes. Tourism, as including seeking treatment, and then younger Afghans would seek a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and you have some franchise degrees that are very attractive to Afghans. Their hope, much like your youth, being to get quality education in Sri Lanka is really the best in South Asia. If you compare it with the rest of the region, Sri Lanka's institutions that have been to public universities, some of your private universities. And I tell young Sri Lankans that you're blessed. Don't take these opportunities for granted, because your degrees are very competitive. The quality of education is very competitive. And so Afghans know about this. And recently I had a very good meeting with the Vice Chancellor of your Defense University, KDU, and we discussed, an increase in the number of scholarships for Afghan students, including bringing our cadets and, forces here for, exchanging experience, expertise in the areas of shared interest, including training, and of course also encouraged joint research and faculty exchange, faculty from KDU to go and teach at a police academy and army academy in Afghanistan. Learning from our special operations experience, we have the best special forces in the region, much like you do as well from your combat experience against terrorism. And so principally, again, coming back to tourism, just pure tourism, medical tourism, higher education. I think the second this COVID issues resolve and there is a flight, I could tell you within less than a year, hundreds of thousands of Afghans would be in Sri Lanka. And I had a good meeting with the Minister of Tourism on this issue, with the former Minister of Tourism. They all understand this, they all support it. We just look forward to an end to this pandemic so that we can go about this business.
We do too look forward to expanded ties and people-to-people contact. We'll take a short commercial break here at Hyde Park. Do stay with us. Welcome back. From tourism back to extremism, I'd like to talk a little about how we can work together as two countries that have faced similar challenges. We spoke about extremist breeding grounds, ISIS caliphates in the region, and also Sri Lanka. It was only on the 21st of April 2019 when Sri Lanka actually faced this challenge, faced the threat, the brutality of such extremism, and we opened our eyes to it. That's when everyone started talking about it. And thereon we faced several other challenges concerning religion, hate speech, discrimination, but these were also elements that were operating in Sri Lanka. But when we talk about collaborating to eliminate extremist ideologies, how can we work together? Because I understand you come from that background. You know what these extremist ideologies are. We know what we say, what it is when we say Islamist extremists. But how do you prefer to go about eliminating these groups?
I think it's a bit difficult. I mean, contexts differ. In our case, of course, much of extremism is exported to Afghanistan. The whole infrastructure that is, promoting and manufacturing and then using extremism and fusing it with acts of terrorism is outside Afghanistan. Basically, we're very much a victim of that exported threat. But then it's increasingly online. That no countries now...
It's online.
It's online. Much of radicalization also happens online. Say there are platforms in certain countries in the region, but then youth are mostly online. They spend a lot of time on internet. They surf social media pages, like you said, which was an issue here following the Easter attacks. And so they over time can be influenced, and youth are very impressionable and they can be influenced. And so that's why the role of education on the one hand, and providing opportunities, and then on the part of the leaderships of the region to reject any fueling of say ethno-sectarian grievances that could be exploited by terrorists and extremist groups, and as well as their state actor supporters. And so I think this is something that everyone knows in Sri Lanka and the rest of South Asia, and that's why we encourage all state actors in the region to join hands in the fight against extremism, to identify those sources, the networks, the individuals behind promoting extremism and efforts to radicalize youth and brainwash them to the extent that we saw what happened in April here in Sri Lanka. Just a bunch of brainwashed. It has nothing to do with Islam. Islam is one of the most tolerant, peaceful religions.
We have a rich culture where we have coexistence. Sinhalese, Buddhists, Christians, Catholics, Burghers, Hindus, Tamils, Muslims, Islams. We have Arab traders who have historically preferred sailing to Sri Lanka. But you did talk about education. In the contrary, we saw that in Sri Lanka, some of the most educated youth were actually the perpetrators in these attacks, those who were easily radicalized. Where do you think this kind of education or their background allowed this kind of radicalization to seep in?
I mean, de-radicalization education, moving forward, promoting, social harmony and things like that.
Yes, but what I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, from your experience also is that these educated youth, this trend we have seen not just in the recent attacks in Sri Lanka, but in the region too, educated youth falling prey to such ideologies.
Well, but it's such a minority. I mean, it's possible. Educated, not only, I think, in case of Islam, but also other religions, because they're extremists in other faiths and philosophies as well. They're Jewish extremists, they're Christian extremists, they're Buddhist extremists. So we should reject all shades and colors of extremism, and that's why all communities, if it is a diverse country like Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, the communities should come together. The leaders of the communities should come together to condemn such acts, and then to share what they know, what they can learn from the educational systems. The curriculum is very important, that events like that, when it happens, unfortunately, tragically, then we should draw lessons to probe why it happened. Then how can we adjust, the education curriculum such that it discourages such acts, informs, the youth of the consequences, and introduces those behind us, be it, non-state actors, the so few extremists of any faith, any religion, so that they have an awareness that those who were brainwashed, in case of Sri Lanka, some of whom, like you said, were educated, if they've been really, been properly educated and known of their acts that would kill so many innocent people ruthlessly, I don't think if they would have carried it out. And so, yes, they were educated, maybe in business, maybe in, but not enough overall, yes, not to basically take the lives of other innocent people who had done nothing to really, hurt them or harm them. So there's no justification whatsoever, for extremism and promotion of terrorism, and use it as a state policy. The United Nations is very clear on this. The United Nations strategy in the fight against terrorism is very clear, is a good definition of what constitutes terrorism, and what basically also leads and fuels terrorism, which radicalism and extremism. And then there's so much literature on ways to de-radicalize those who have been radicalized, and to proactively prevent a situation where such radicalization happens. And there, I think, in most societies, especially in our region, poverty is rife.
Right.
We need to eradicate poverty. It's a shared interest and concern of South Asia, and that's why they created the South Asian Regional Association, Association for Regional Cooperation, or SARC, to actually address the problem of poverty, and to ensure and bring prosperity for the region. So that's another way to do this on the long run.
Certainly, Sri Lanka, a multicultural, multi-ethnic island nation with rich heritage that we offer to the nation, which you have very much spoken of during this program. And I hope and I believe that when you go back to Afghanistan and the rest of the world, you'll take the message that Sri Lanka has to offer. But what we are interested right now is how you will look at working closely, especially in cultural ties, especially in nourishing this heritage, where we can explore and exchange our knowledge, our knowledge and religious experiences, so that we build a more healthier two nations.
Exactly. I mean, Sri Lanka, like you said, is one of the most diverse nations in South Asia. It is the oldest democracy in South Asia. We're inspired by your democratic process. That's why we welcomed warmly the electoral victories of the Prime Minister, the President. A large number of Sri Lankans turned out to vote for peace, security, the further institutionalization of democracy, and as well as in partnership with the rest of the region. And especially with Afghanistan, like I said, we share a common cultural heritage and civilization that goes back to the Buddhist era in Afghanistan, and that's why these statues of the Buddha in central province of Bamyan are a testament to that shared heritage, which our president pointed out in his congratulatory message to the Prime Minister. We'd like to build on that shared heritage and the diversities and the pluralism and the many opportunities which we discussed in this interview.
You touched on the
further
Bamyan.
Bringing the two nations together.
You touched on the Bamyan statues. Sri Lankans were devastated at the horror back in the day. But I suppose building on cultural heritage and what we have to share is the way forward.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time
welcome.
here in our studios at Hyde Park.
Thank you.
I had with me here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24 Ambassador Ashraf Haidari, who was also the Director General of Policy and Strategy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan before his assignment in Sri Lanka. He has also served as the Deputy Ambassador of Afghanistan to India and the United States, prior to which he was Afghanistan's Deputy Assistant National Security Advisor for Policy and Oversight. And it goes on, but that's all the time we have here at Hyde Park. Thank you for joining us. Have a pleasant evening.